I think about my own upbringing and education. I was born on my mother's side in a rich zamindar family of Bihar. My father belonged to a relatively poor family, but he died when I was only a few months old. So I was brought up by my mother's people in the atmosphere and even the luxury of a well to do family. I went to a school which had been founded by my great grandfather as a charitable act. It was not of a very high standard, therefore, it was run as a charitable institution. The teachers were not fancy by any means, but in those days, even charitable schools used to have much better teachers than we see today in most better class schools. After schooling, I went to the Benares Hindu University, where I did my degree. Now I changed my subjects. I did science for my intermediate and economics and mathematics for my BA. I refer to this because, in a sense, I have never been a specialist. I have changed from one subject to another, and I have written and talked about a vast range of subjects, not because I have studied them. The only label I would like to see attached to myself is not that of an economist merely because I did a good degree in economics in Cambridge, nor of an administrator because I did a long spell as an administrator, nor of a diplomat because I was ambassador to the USA at a very critical hour, but just that I am a thinker. I am a thinker, a free thinker. I do not subscribe to any ideology or any creed, so any ism. And that is why I get sometimes the support of some people, and at another time the same people turn against me because I am not going along with the kind of evolution of thought which they expected of me, because they were identifying themselves with me up to a point and no more. Now, when I was studying in England, I first could not get admission into Cambridge. I went to the London University, where Mr. Gateskill, who later became the Labour Party's leader in British Parliament, was my tutor, and he said that, look, you must go to Cambridge, you are very brilliant and you are doing so well in economics that I would like you to go and work under the best people who are now in Cambridge, and I'll secure you admission without any problem. I said, fine. When I got the admission, then I went to India House because all Indian students were supposed to get themselves admitted to British universities only through the Education Department of India House. And I caused quite a flutter because how dare you get yourself admitted without our knowledge? But anyway, the storm subsided. Then I got a bit of a blow from Cambridge. They said, we have admitted you on condition that you do not sit for the ICS this year. Because if you sit for it, we gather you will get in, and then you won't be able to finish your degree, and we will have wasted our seat. So I said, all right, I had forgo the first chance, I'll take it next year when I can complete my probation and my degree together. So I went to Cambridge. In Cambridge, of course, I was studying economics, but I also got involved a great deal in the Cambridge Union as a debater, and also I had done some debating in India. But at the end of my first year, when I got into the ICS exam as a probationer in 1936, then in my speeches in Cambridge, I had to be a little restrained because already I was under the civil service discipline, as it were. Once I got nearly into trouble, there was a debate on the British Sunday, how dull it is. And I said that in India, Sunday is a day of universal rejoicing because it is the day on which the white man prays for his soul. And this remark was reproduced in the London papers. I was sent for by the India House that, look, you should not be making political speeches. I said, but it's not a political speech. No, this is verging on politics. You are, in fact, speaking up against British rule. I said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that implication. I'll bear it in mind in the future. Thereafter, Mohan Kumar Mangalam, who had come up as an undergraduate. So I said that now on all matters where India's freedom or anything else is involved, you will do the speaking. I'll help you with this as much as I can, but I won't speak. So with that kind of a division of labor, we went on, and I held some offices in the union, and I came into India in 1937. I was posted to Bihar, province of Bihar, and Ranchi was the place where I first joined service. I was transferred from one place to another during the first 3 years of my service. The last post I held in Bihar government in a field job was as subdivisional officer in Jamshedpur. There was a time when the war broke out, and part of my responsibilities, especially in Jamshedpur with the steel plant there, got linked with national security as well. Well, one exposure I had to it was that one fine morning I was approached by the policemen with great agitation that we have detected an enemy agent going around the steelworks, near the steelworks, and we have arrested him, so would you come and interrogate him? I went to see the man. He was an Italian. I knew him as a confectioner who was making cakes in Ranchi and selling them. So he was nearly 80 years of age. I said, good God, Pedro, how did you get into this trying to sabotage a steel plant? It's sabotage. I was in jail as an enemy subject. I was released because I was considered to be totally harmless. And I was asked to go back to Ranchi. But because the train connection failed, I got off in Jamshedpur and went to the police station to surrender myself. That this is how I am here. And then they arrested me. But the trouble was that these people, having been told to be on the lookout for enemy spies, had to show that they had caught something. But one piece of espionage which came to my notice really shook me. There was a barber shop in Jamshedpur, but run by Japanese. Everyone went to him because it was the only respectable saloon. The Tata company's top people lie, and everybody used to go to him. And the day before Pearl Harbor raid, he disappeared. Now, when Pearl Harbor raid took place, then Japan became an enemy country, and we went to arrest him. There was no sign of him. And inside his barber shop, we found transmitting equipment, plans of the steel plant, and everything. So espionage was going on in a big way, which nobody had detected. Anyway, soon thereafter, I went to the Bihar Secretariat as an undersecretary in the local self-government department. And within months thereafter, I was taken by the government of India, sent to Calcutta to be an undersecretary in the supply department, which had a munitions production branch in Calcutta. And that is when my first involvement in economic administration began, because the task was to maximize the supplies of things needed for the war effort from indigenous sources. So this meant planning their production in the country. At the same time, to regulate imports, which had to be strictly rationed because shipping space was short, to support the war effort, and to maintain civil supplies. Now, civil supplies was but not my responsibility. But I was involved in things like the import of steel and other things, how they were to be rationed. At that point of time, there was the question that we had some steel production, fair amount of steel production in Jamshedpur as well as in Burnpur. And the imported steel had to come to supplement it. But we wanted the maximum of domestic steel to be used for the war effort, supplemented by import. So the iron and steel control was set up to ration steel supplies to those who had war orders in accordance with war orders. As regards the price of steel, Indian steel, what the steel producers would get, the decision was that whatever price they had when the war broke out was to be accepted without question as normal and natural. And thereafter, their price will only be raised if costs went up. So this was the beginning of the cost plus formula of pricing, which came to be used later. And then, since there was imported steel and domestic steel, a system of pooling of prices was started so that the average equalized price was stable and not subject to changes. So, in a sense, in a very embryonic shape, most of the controls which we used later after independence took their roots during the war inside an office where I was only an undersecretary. Then I became a deputy secretary, and then I came to Delhi during just after in 46, which was roughly a year before independence. We were already talking of the possibility of transfer of power, and I was then in the Ministry of Commerce dealing with shipping. Then one fine morning, after the negotiations were going on for some time, it was announced that Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru will come and assume the office of the Prime Minister. Till then, as civil servants, we did not know what was happening, though the papers were full of it. Also, every day in the evening, Mahatma Gandhi used to give a talk at the Bhangi colony. And it was amazing how, in an hour, he would do a commentary even on the political talks going on without revealing secrets, but by merely projecting his thoughts on different issues. He was giving a kind of guidance, a philosophy. It was fascinating to listen to that. I think the All India Radio has got the tape recordings of most of them. But then came the great day when Jawaharlal Nehru drove up between the North Block and South Block. And the entire secretariat lined both sides of the street to cheer him. A few days later, he decided to go around the ministries, and he came to my room. Now, I was dealing with the mercantile marine, which was then under the Commerce Department. And in my room, there was a map of India with little dots, and there was an electrical gadget. The dots signified India's lighthouses. And the electrical gadget made each point give the flash signals by which each lighthouse was identified. Now, mariners know which lighthouse gives what signals. So if they see a lighthouse, they can say where they are. So this was the purpose of the map. Now, Panditji was fascinated by a gadget, a scientific gadget, so he immediately said, start this. And as it would happen, when I pressed the switch on, nothing happened. I was feeling very ashamed at the whole situation, and I was no mechanic to be able to repair it, but I just gave the thing a kick. And that kick started it, and it began to give all the right signals, so the crisis passed. But within weeks, I got involved in the partition secretariat. We had the task of working on the partition of the country. And there were teams set up to deal with separate subjects, with counterparts from the Indian side and the Pakistani side. Now, these small committees would report to the parent body, which was the partition secretariat, and on top was the partition council, which included Pandit Nehru, Sardar Patel, Mr. Jinnah, and Liaquat Ali Khan. Now, we used to have meetings every morning at one Safdarjung Road, which was then the residence of H.M. Patel, and to clear ideas between different groups. All the Indian team members sat together, and then we would go to the various committees to negotiate. There were, H.M. Patel was at the head, K.B. Lal was there, Jagannathan was there, Wanchu was there. So there were quite a number of mostly ICS people, but not exclusively ICS, there were others also. But they were all people in services of the rank of Deputy Secretary, Joint Secretary or Secretary. Mr. Ambegaonkar was there. Now, before we got embarked on this exercise, The day the partition of the country was officially announced, Sardar Patel summoned all the Indian ICS officers to his residence in Aurangzeb Road. And he said to us, and H.M. Patel was sitting by his side, he said to us that I depend on the 411 of you to help us not only with partition, but to fulfill the great responsibility which will fall on our shoulders when India becomes independent. Now, this figure 411, I discovered later, was the number of the ICS officers who had opted to stay in India and continue to serve, as against those who had chosen either to retire or to go to Pakistan. So he had great faith in the ICS, and this came through also in the way he fought not only for the ICS but for all the services and their service rights in the constitution making stage. Because there was a strong feeling that these ICS men have served the Britishers, why should they be retained? Though it might seem that you would be faced with such conflicts, in actual fact, over a very wide range of things, you acted with independence and integrity, with no political interference. Now, when I say no political interference, I want to explain it. The top posts which could be regarded as political, such as members of the Governor's Council, were equal to cabinet ministers, they were also filled by servicemen. The top governor also, except in the three presidency towns of Bombay, Calcutta and Madras, were also servicemen. Most of them belonged to the ICS itself. So they spoke the same language. They had personal contacts from earlier days. So there was no feeling of a big boss over you. And in that environment, impartiality was absolutely a must. Integrity was a must. And again, for some time in the Bihar days, there was a Congress government in power. I must say that again there was no difficulty either on the part of the ministers or on the part of civil servants in carrying on different policies as enjoined by the ministers. For example, in Bihar, there was rent reduction law enacted by the Congress government. Now people of the ICS and the provincial service were engaged in the rent reduction, and they did their job thoroughly and efficiently and with enthusiasm because the idea appealed to them. Now in the British days, no attempt had been made to change the rent laws. Now this was, many of us might have felt like that, but it was not as if there was a malignant effect. It was much more that they were, being aliens, not prepared to intervene and interfere in the life of the people. Now, when I was in the supply department, then I did begin to feel that there was a certain amount of undercurrent of prejudice and sympathy for business houses with British ownership and capital as against purely indigenous business houses. But this element came very largely because a lot of people from civil life, from business, were inducted into the supply department, and they did not have the service discipline behind them. And their roots were in Clive Street of Calcutta. So in their mind, the prejudice was there, which again was a matter where the members of the service, both white and brown, were fighting against. Because the tradition of integrity was there, and we could not persuade ourselves, those who were in the regular service, to distinguish between one company and another on the ground this was British owned. But I cannot say that the national level policies, where there was a conflict between British and Indian interests, would not be pro-British. They were. But that clash would not come to the operative level at which I was functioning. It may be at the highest level, but even there I would point out that when it came to negotiating the settlement of sterling balances which India had piled up during the World War II. Sir Jeremy Raceman, an Englishman, finance member of the Viceroy's Council, he fought for India's rights against the British government, against the British Chancellor. In a way, the British Chancellor was really angry, but he did, because his attachment and his loyalty to the interest he was representing, he made the most powerful pleas that I could have heard. But how you can't deprive a poor country like India by saying that you bear the cost of the war because we protected you. You're protecting your interests, and you didn't pay India then, but the debts you must repay. You may say you can't afford to pay immediately. All right, take your time. And he stuck to his guns, so sterling balances were not written off. So I would say that the feeling that there was a constant conflict of interest did not come to me, because when the war had broken out, when actually I was really active, there was a community of interest. We wanted more production at home. We wanted the war to succeed. We did not want to be overrun by Germans or Japanese. So in that kind of a framework, the feeling that in my day-to-day operations, I'm being interfered with or bossed over was not there. But, of course, the enthusiasm with which Pandit Nehru was welcomed itself brought out how joyous it was for us to feel that we are free. So that lack of freedom for the nation rather than as civil servants was certainly at the minds of all of us. But not that I am being made to do a dirty job which I don't like. That was not at least my experience. And take V.P. Menon. He rose to be a secretary from clerical ranks, but he had served as a clerk in the Reforms Office under the Viceroy. And it's there that his talent and experience and knowledge sprouted to the level that he could be so helpful in the transfer of power and in drafting constitutional provisions. So that ability and capability were both items on which there was sufficient emphasis, and it is this which Sardar Patel recognized. He said that you are trained administrators, you have a discipline and certain qualities of integrity and fairness. So we would not lose you. The British government was offering us all huge sums as retirement benefit. Sardar Patel took the line that you give it to the Britishers, but to the Indian members, no, unless we ask anyone to leave. If we suspect somebody's loyalty and ask him to leave, he will get the compensation which you have offered him. But those whom we want to retain, I'll guarantee them the same terms and conditions of service as they had under you. So why should they leave? I don't want to give them the option of leaving by a lucrative golden handshake, because I don't want to lose them. And actually nobody wanted to leave. And in fact, we were quite reconciled to have even cuts in our pay, but he said, no, not in your life. You are under contract of service. You continue on your terms. So the partition thing got going, and one or two things I recall, that at the top level, when it came to the partition council where Pandit Nehru, Sardar Patel, and Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan were there, Mountbatten used to be able to get his way because he had studied the facts of the case and paper with much greater thoroughness than our political leaders or the Pakistani leaders did, who relied on their own general vision. But they hadn't done the detailed homework on the merits of the case. So Mountbatten was able to get his way time and again. Then I like to jump to an episode. The rioting began in the wake of partition. Trainloads of people used to come in from Punjab, bloodstained, wounded, dying. And there was rioting, reflex rioting in Delhi also. So both K.B. Lal and I were taken out of our secretariat desk and asked to go to the town hall in Old Delhi and operate a control room from there. Now, one of the things we discovered was that while things were tranquil and peaceful, when a train load of refugees came from Pakistan, they just could not tolerate the sight of a Muslim being going around safely in Delhi when in Pakistan Hindus and Sikhs were being butchered and driven out. And those Sikhs who had kirpans would pull out their kirpan to attack a Muslim whom they saw. The Hindus who had a lathi would attack him with lathi. And so each point of entry, each arrival of a train from Pakistan began a fresh spark of rioting. And we were trying our best to control it. Then again, Pandit Nehru one evening came in. It's an amusing episode. And he looked at us and talked to us. And then he said, when a shop is being looted, your policemen go there, the looters disappear. But then the moment your police goes away, they come back and start looting again. I said, sir, this is perfectly true. Do you know how to stop that? So we looked at him for words of wisdom. Tell your policemen to carry locks and key and put it on once they have dispersed the looting crowd. So I looked at a man called Sanjeevi. He was the chief commissioner of police. Sanjeevi is your line of country. How do you react to this suggestion? So he scratched his head and said, sir, very often there is no door left to which the lock and key could be affixed. At that point, Pandit Nehru lit a cigarette and walked out in disgust. Well, after that came the phase when the planning process got started. I was never in the planning commission as such, but my relationship with it was very, very close. And especially as the Commerce Ministry where I was became the Commerce and Industry Ministry. And therefore, in the industrial development and implementation of the plan, priorities and targets in the industrial sector, I got involved in a big way. Now, my task at that stage was mainly to deal with cases of industrial licensing. A new act had been passed, the Industries Development and Regulation Act, and the idea was to canalize investment into the priority sectors in accordance with planned targets. Now, the technique used was to give a license to people to fulfill the target, according to the target. Now, at that time, it seemed a very nice way of dealing with the problem. There was tremendous spurt of applications. Everybody was wanting to invest in every kind of industry. So all that the licensing committee had to do was to see that for each industry, enough licenses were given, not too much, not too little, to attain the planned target. And at the same time, in the process, if there were too many applications, to use some rational judgments in selecting who should get the license. Now, the factors we began to attach importance to was, firstly, is the project going to an area which needs development? If it's going to an underdeveloped area, give it some preference. If it's a new entrepreneur, give him some preference over an old established house. But it was not a written law, no regulations were there. These were decisions taken if and only if the number of applications exceeded the capacity which we could create. And actually, we sanctioned a little more capacity than the plan warranted to allow for some shortfall. Somebody won't complete the project in time. And so, during that phase, industrial licensing proceeded very smoothly, and it was an exciting period. We talk today of liberalization, I'll come to that later. But at that time, industrial licensing itself was liberal. It was not a restrictive thing. It was giving a guidance. And industry as a whole welcomed the guidance, because otherwise you would have had too much capacity in some sectors and a neglect of capacity in others. Do you want to put the question?
Yeah, I was just saying, sir, many people say that the creation of Bangladesh was India's brainchild, and the recent act of terrorism in Punjab and the demand for Khalistan is kind of a revenge by Pakistan, sir. How would you react to this?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that Bangladesh was a brainchild of Indians. Long ago, Aurobindo had made a forecast that if India is partitioned, it won't be into two countries, it will become three countries, because he had seen from his saintly vision the impossibility of West Pakistan and East Pakistan living together when they were so different culturally, ethnically, linguistically, and in every other way. Second, as I told you, the first person to mention the birth of Bangladesh was Henry Kissinger, an observer of the political scene, a very shrewd, astute, competent observer. But it was his judgment also that this is where the logic of history is moving. Now, as regards your second part, I have no doubt at all that Pakistan's support to Khalistan movement is at least in part inspired by the feeling that after all you got Bangladesh out of us, so we'll get a part of your territory out of your land. But equally important to my mind is not just the consideration of simple vengeance, but something more deep rooted, namely that Punjab has been the bulwark against any Pakistani aggression towards India. And if the Punjabi people become pro Pakistan, then any invading army of Pakistan would find the road to Delhi so much easier, carrying the support of people whom they have made disloyal to India.